Welcome back, guys. So as you saw in the previous lesson, we were able to use JavaScript to select HTML elements and change its color property. Now, I showed you one way of doing this using a method called query selector, but there's actually a lot more ways that you can do this. Now, I've added a few classes and IDs to our current web page, so we can try out all of the different ways of selecting elements inside the DOM. Now, the first one I want to show you is the get elements by tag name. And what this does is that it looks through the web page and it searches for the elements with a particular tag name. So for example, if we wanted to get a list item, as we have here, we have 3 list items inside a unordered list. If we ran this line of code, get elements by tag name, then you'll see that we actually get back an array that contains all 3 of our list items. And if you expand this, you can see that each list item has a whole bunch of properties that you can tap into and you can manipulate. Now, the important thing about this method and where it differs from the previous one that we used, which is query selector, is if you notice the word elements is plural here. And what this means is that it's going to fetch all of the elements that have this particular tag name. So it's not just going to fetch one. Now, this is important because when you try to manipulate one of these elements, say if we try to tap into the 3rd list item, then we can simply say get elements by tag name. And whereas before we just said .style .color equals, say, I don't know, purple, then this is not going to work because even though the error that you get is a little bit misleading, it says cannot set property of undefined. And the problem is that we're trying to set the color purple to an array, which doesn't work because remember, this part of the code gives us back this array with all 3 list items. And if we try to set its style property, that doesn't make any sense. So what we have to do instead is we have to select the item in the array that we want to change. And remember, when we select items in arrays, we always use the square brackets. So if we wanted the 3rd item, then we would put in the index number 2. And then now if we set style.color equals purple, then you can see that it's changed our 3rd list item to a purple text. Now, if you're at all confused about arrays, then be sure to go back to the last module where we spoke about arrays in detail. And you can get to grips with this idea before you head back and we continue. Now, in addition to being able to tap into a particular element inside this array of items that all have the tag name li, we can also use some of the other things that we saw that you can do with arrays. Namely, for example, if we wanted to know how many elements there were that have the tag name li, then we can simply generate the array of all of the items and then call .length to get the length property. And that will tell us that there are 3 li items in total on this entire page. So that's pretty neat. Now, along this line of get element by, you can see that there's a whole bunch of other ones. And another useful one is get elements by class name. So what this does is it allows you to select elements based on the name of the class. So you can see here in our web page, I've given a class to some of these elements. So for example, the button element has a class of btn. So we can select that button by saying document.getElements by class name, and then inside here we'll add the class btn. Now, notice this method also has a plural elements. So that means that we're also going to get back an array. So it doesn't matter whether if you only have one item that has the class btn, it's still going to give you back an array. So that means that doing this also does not work. And so even if there's only one item that has that particular class that you're selecting, you still have to select the first item using the square brackets and using the index 0. Now, the final one in this style of get elements by is the get elements by ID. And the keen-eyed amongst you might have noticed that in this case, the word element is no longer plural. And so, in fact, using this method, you only get back one item instead of an array. And the reason being, of course, that on a single web page, every single ID should be unique. So you should not have the same ID on more than one element. So, for example, in our case, we've got the ID list for our unordered list, and we've got the ID title for our H1. So if I select on that title ID, then I will only get back a single item as opposed to an array of items. And in this case, we're getting back our H1. So if I wanted to change the text inside that title, I can say simply select the element that has the ID title and then change its inner HTML to say, I don't know, goodbye. Now that text has gone from hello to goodbye by selecting it and then manipulating it. Now, another method that can be used to select a single element is the query selector method that we already saw in the last lesson. Now, this method, similar to getElementById, also only returns a single item. But it works a little bit differently because the string that you're going to put inside the parentheses is a selector. Now, what are selectors? Well, we've been using it in our CSS all of this time. Here's the styles.css for our TinDog website. And you can see that the selector that we use in CSS is just the part that we specify before the curly braces. So to select elements, we simply just write the name of the element. To select classes, we add a dot in front of the name of the class. And to select IDs, we add the £sign in front. And of course, with selectors, we can combine different things. For example, an ID with a class or a class with an element. And it's a much more specific way of selecting a particular thing inside your website in order to change. So let's head back over here and let's use our query selector to select something. So whereas before, when I used getElementById, I could only specify a valid ID, and when it was getElementsByClass, then I could only put in a class. Inside here, I could put in an element, a class, or an ID. It doesn't really matter. So for example, if I want to select our H1, then I can simply say H1 in here. Or if I wanted to select it by its ID, then I could say query selector, and in here I would add that £sign to show that I'm specifying an ID. Then I would use the ID title, and still we would get back exactly the same thing. And it works exactly the same way with class as well. All we have to do is just add a dot in front, just as we did inside the CSS. So if I wanted our button, then I can just say .btn, and I would get back our button. But more importantly, I can combine our selectors and query for something that's quite specific. So for example, we've got a link here inside our first list item. Now let's say that we have another link that's just free floating around. And I only wanted to select the link that was inside the list item. Well, I can do that by combining my selector and saying, select the anchor tag inside the list element. And remember, when we're doing hierarchical selectors, there's a space between the two selectors. So now if I hit enter, then you can see that I'm getting back the aref that's inside our li as opposed to this one. Whereas if I just said query selector a tag, then I would get back this first one. As you can see, the highlighting is showing you which one we're getting back from these results. Now, I can also combine my selectors by saying something like, I want the element that has a class of item that is also an li element. So to do that, I would say li dot to specify the class, which is called item. And remember, when you're combining selectors, so things that occur in the same element, then there are no spaces. So whereas before it was the anchor element inside the list element, so hierarchical, the child of this parent. In this case, it's all in the same element. It's the list item that also has a class of item. So now if I hit enter, you can see I get back my first list item. And you can also use the ID as well. So for example, in this case, what do you think I will select based off this selector? 5 seconds, see if you can get the answer. All right, so this is a hierarchical selector, as you can tell by the space in between the two selectors. So in this case, we're looking for an anchor tag that is inside something that has an ID of list. So in that case, that is going to be this one, which is a child, or rather a grandchild of this unordered list with an ID of list. And if I hit enter, we can confirm the answer. Now, here's a question. What if your selector matches more than one object? Because if I say, for example, ID list with a class of item, then you can see that all three of these list items satisfy that query. They all have a class of item, and they're all nested under a UL with an ID of list. So which one do you get back? Well, actually, you only get back the first item in the document that satisfies that selector. Now, what if you wanted all of the objects that match that selector? Well, then you would have to use a slightly different method. Instead of query selector, which sounds very singular, you would have to use a method called query selector all. And now, by using this exact same line of code, other than that word all, we get back a list of all three list items that satisfy that particular selector. And similar to before, if you wanted to change and manipulate items in here, you would have to specify their index because it's an array. Now, given that we've seen all of these different types of ways of selecting our HTML elements, which one should you actually use? Well, query selector and its slightly greedier brother, query selector all, allow for more complex queries because we're able to specify ID, class, element, tag names, and combine them in order to target the exact element that we want. Whereas the getElement methods are more broad, and it's more difficult to target individual objects without going in to change the HTML. So generally, in the code that you'll come across in the wild, you'll see query selector a lot more than getElement. As in most cases, you can use query selector and query selected all to do all the things that you can do with the getElement methods. So I recommend that you try out all of them, and you'll get a feel for which one will be the most adaptable and which one you'll find to be the most useful in your case. Now, as a challenge, I want you to use what you learned in this lesson to change the text color of the Google link over here. So not this one, but this one. Now, remember that if you look at the DOM tree, that link is an anchor tag nested inside a list element. So try and see if you can change its color to red. Pause the video and complete the challenge now. All right, so how did that go? Well, remember that the anchor tag that we want to change is nested inside an li, inside a UL. So in order to change the color of our Google link, we have to select the anchor tag and not just the list item. So to do that, we have to tap into the document, and then we have to query selector for a anchor tag that is inside a list element. And now we can use this. And now let's just confirm that we've got the right one. There we go. And the anchor tag that we want is being highlighted. So we can now go and simply set its style.color to red. There we go. And now that link is red. Now, if you try to do this just by selecting the first list item, then this will only change the color of the bullet point without changing the color of the text. And that is because this anchor tag is actually a separate element from the list item. So maybe that was a little bit mean on my part, but I hope it was fun trying it out nonetheless. So in the next lesson, we're going to learn more about how we can manipulate the CSS styles using JavaScript. So I'll see you on the next lesson.